It's 7 o'clock. Let's get to it. It's Topical starts right now. A very good evening to you, South African, those watching around the world. My name is Blaine Herman, and this is It's Topical, our digital audience with us tonight. It's good to have them. They're from the Northwest University, UKZN, UNISA, and WITS. Among them, our guest, Khaya Sithole, is there. They will weigh in terms of some of the burning questions that they have for our guests. Looking forward to it. Pravin Gordhan, a South African politician and anti-apartheid activist. He's held several cabinet posts under successive ANC-led governments, right? Since his passing, though, his legacy has been topical. What legacy does Gordhan leave behind? Depends on who you ask, right? The EFF says Gordhan's legacy is one of failure, exploitation, and corruption. On the other hand, President Cyril Ramaphosa said in the latter years of Gordhan's service to this nation, and as a beacon of the fight against corruption, he stood up to the derisions and threats emanating from some in our nation who were scorched by his insistence that justice be dispensed against those who sought to undermine our democracy and raid our public resources and assets. See what I mean when I say it depends on who you ask? How do you see it? It's important to understand a prominent person's legacy. Why? Because it provides lessons for all of us to learn from. And in understanding these lessons, it has the potential to move the needle, one would say, help us on the road to better. So the intention is not to impute. Our intention is to provide context and understanding. Tonight's program is aimed at that, and getting a sober analysis of his life and legacy, which brings us to the question of the week. And we ask you, what stood out for you from the life and career of former Minister and SARS Commissioner Pravin Gordhan? Let us know at SABC News_TV. Let's walk and talk, get you some context. Since his death, you've seen it. There's been mixed reactions in terms of his legacy. So we want to get to the bottom of it. Why is there such a divide in terms of that? Please let us know at It's Topical, at SABC News _TV. That's the handle. Perspective coming up. All right, let's get you that context. And as always, we turn to the magic wall, what we know and why it matters. My guest tonight is SABC News political editor, Mzondile Mbeche. Good to have you on the program, sir. Need your better mind to understand the context. So let's look at Gordhan's activism and political impact. Give us a snapshot of your understanding.
Well, thank you very much, Blaine. I mean, we all know who Minister Pravin Gordhan was, or former minister. We all know the role that he played. In fact, many people would obviously know him when he was in public office, whether he was as a SARS commissioner or as a minister, Minister of Finance, Public Enterprises, Cooperative Governance. But before that, remember as a country where we come from, Blaine. We come from a country that struggled to get to where we are as a free, democratic South Africa. This is one of the guys who was very pivotal in that struggle. These are the people who were involved in some underground activities. These are some of the guys who were arrested. Of course, there's something that is very interesting that was said by the former ANC president, Oliver Tambo. Yeah. I mean, when you look at what is happening now, particularly within the ANC, how they are fighting, how factionalism is. But he said something very interesting to say, you discover once you are in power that actually it's much more difficult than when you are outside. So, Pravin Gordhan was someone who struggled for this country, and then, of course, and then reaped the benefits of being in power, and then how it went about,
Right.
and then how it impacted people differently. So it's also a subject for further discussion.
You mentioned the divisions within the ANC, and yet Pravin Gordhan, for many people's understanding, was fiercely loyal to the ANC. What kept him in there?
Well, remember, when you joined the struggle then, when you interact with people who have been part of the struggle, they tell you it was not about personal gain, but it was about the desire to see a free, non-racial, democratic South Africa. If you believed in those values, if you were committed to that, so that what made you. I mean, even now, if you speak to a number of people about political parties, I mean, people will still generally say the ANC, in terms of capturing the mood of South Africa, remains the best in terms of what is written down.
Yeah.
So whether they implement it, that's a different matter altogether. So if then you have a belief system or values that talk to that, so it's easy for you to then remain loyal to that kind of an organization.
Right. Let's talk more about some of his key roles in government. He, had a number of roles. But here's the one towards the end that I want to focus on. One of my guests, Khaya Sithole, said that he bravely accepted the albatross that was the Public Enterprises Department. I wonder if he did himself any favors accepting that.
Well, you know what they normally say, particularly the ANC people, wherever the ANC deploys me, I will go. So that's what exactly happened. So the Public Enterprises Department, which is very complex, which is very huge, which had to manage a lot of interests. So clearly, despite his service, so there was a lot that obviously maybe didn't go well. I mean, I guess, I think the recent example is, I think the Topical deal of the SAA, and I think people keep mentioning that.
Right.
And then, of course, looking at how some of the public enterprises were failing, whatever reason, but remember, as a political head, will look to you to say, why is something like this happening? So that role, yes, he did his fair share, but of course, I think he could have done better in some aspects.
Right. I want to touch more on that with our guest as well, former Finance Minister Trevor Manuel, who knows him pretty well and can give us some context. But let's talk about some of the critical moments in Gordhan's service. What stands out for you, Mzwai?
You know, one of the things where I think as a human being, where he really was called upon to then save the situation, I'll put it that way. You'd recall when I think former President Zuma had appointed, I think, Des Van Rooyen as the finance minister. But then there was a huge outcry, and then the markets were going south, and everything was happening. So that really was not favoring the country. And then he was the person who was called again to occupy that seat. So clearly to try and stabilize the markets. I mean, so that showed that there was a lot of interest and rather confidence in what he was able to do. And then as soon as he assumed that responsibility, so you saw the stability.
You mentioned former President Jacob Zuma. What have we heard from him since the passing of Pravin Gordhan?
Well, interestingly, given the public fallout that we know between him and Pravin Gordhan, so we were looking forward to hearing what he was going to say. But remember, Blaine, these are comrades. In fact, as the minister, former President Zuma is the person who appointed Pravin Gordhan as the finance minister. And then yesterday at the funeral service of the MK members, so the former president basically said, you know what, this was my comrade. And then when I first went to Swaziland, I went to ask for money from him at his pharmacy because so that's how close they were. But of course, along the way, things didn't turn out well. But he basically spoke very positively about Pravin Gordhan, despite what happened in later years.
Yeah. His funeral takes place on Thursday.
On Thursday.
On Thursday in the port city of Durban. Yeah. No doubt the SABC will have it covered. Thank you, sir.
Thanks
for your time. All right, that was SABC News political editor Nzondile Mbeche there. Context, always important on this program. We will discuss further. So, anti-apartheid veteran and corruption buster. That's how former Minister Pravin Gordhan is hailed by some. Even President Cyril Ramaphosa described him as a servant who fought inequality, who fought poverty, who fought hunger in South Africa. And this montage reminds us how Gordhan addressed some of the issues facing this country. Take a look.
I'd like to call the meeting to order. I'm going to ask the present chairperson of the Planning Committee to place the proposal before the Council. Mr. Gordhan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. It is firmly believed that South Africans are eagerly awaiting news of concrete and constructive progress in the negotiation process.
Gordhan said organised crime syndicates were involved in schemes which involved forging documents and falsifying export records.
Our battle over the next while is going to be to make sure that people submit those backup documents, without which we're not going to be able to give them the amnesty that they require.
The appointments made in the state-owned enterprises are worsening the crisis in order to justify privatization and mass retrenchment of workers. In addition, if the state of the nation address is to be peaceful, Ramaphosa must do the honorable thing and fire Pravin Gordhan.
This is a difficult time. It is a time when I know that many people are frustrated because of the uncertainty around what is actually happening as a result of the load shedding that is going on in the country. Understanding the context in which we find ourselves, this was an institution, just in case you've forgotten, that was one of the centers of state capture.
The capacity at SAA to do forensics is very, very limited.
There's no doubt that SAA is, in more recent years, a casualty of corruption. I think the idea that they should prepare a report for the Zondo Commission is a good one, so that the truth can be told in an open forum.
At the request of the witness.
The only way to, inverted commas, get rid of some of us was now to continue with this campaign of harassment charges. What we need to do as an absolute necessity is get rid of the culture to keep looking for opportunities to extract money from these entities. So that culture must be an important part of the renewal of the culture, not just in the ANC, but in the alliance and in society as a whole as well.
He fought to liberate this country from the shackles of apartheid, from inequality, from poverty, and from hunger.
And I trust that we have a constructive and open debate. Thank you.
Let's follow on of what Mr. Gordhan said there at the end. Let's have a constructive debate. We're going to get to the bottom of this in terms of helping understand his legacy. Let's get straight to it. If we have to disagree, let's disagree with decency, because the other way gets us nowhere. To help me do this, former Finance Minister Trevor Manuel joins me on the program. Good to have you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your time. Also, on our digital wall, we have Khaya Sithole, academic and commentator. Good to have you on the program, sir, as well. Also, our digital audience, they will be putting up their hands when they have any questions, and then we'll get our guests to answer. Thank you so much for your time. To you, Mr. Manuel, first of all, your relationship with Mr. Gordhan goes back many years. He was appointed as SARS commissioner under the stewardship of you as finance minister, and obviously then both became ministers of finance. Some have described his legacy as complex. What do you think adds to that complexity?
Blaine, it's quite important to provide context, as you said. And the context is actually that Pravin was a lifelong activist. right up to the end of his life. He said that he wanted to be remembered, he'd like to be remembered as an activist. And so whatever he did along the line, he did as an activist. Ours is a relationship that probably stretches 45 years or so. Even before the UDF in 1983, we were already connected. And so through the period, into the 90s, and it's quite important to recognize the value of our Constitution. And in fact, one of the tragedies is that the next generation doesn't engage with our Constitution much, doesn't own it. But if you look at where it was made and how it was made, and Pravin's role as chair of the committee in Parliament that drafted so much of the Constitution, that laid the basis for it, all of that was fundamentally important. It was only later, from about 97, 98, when we started engaging him with the prospect of what was then a leap of faith, because what we have now as a revenue service didn't exist. These were small, there were two departments, Inland Revenue and Customs and Excise. Right. And to take all of that and construct a new modern organization required somebody with enormous capacity, but somebody with enormous trust in the arrangement. And that was where it started. So Pravin becoming a formal commissioner in 1999 was the start of many great things, because it gave substance to our Constitution. We could afford in democracy to provide many of the services because we had adequate revenue resources. I'm saying you can't look at the issues, and I heard the previous discussion. The challenges that arise later in state-owned enterprises have their own history, because you arrive, the cupboard is bare, the debt levels of the state-owned enterprises were massive. Right. My privilege as finance minister was that I didn't ever transfer resources to any of the state-owned enterprises. They conducted their business on the strength of their balance sheet. By the time Pravin got into public enterprise, the balance sheet had been completely destroyed. I'm sure Khaya will have a lot to say about this. But
I want to just take a step back with regards to the context again. We were speaking to economist Dawie Ruert, who lauded Pravin Gordhan's tenure at SARS, said it was excellent. He said less so, though, in finance. He cited a number of reasons. Two of them was above inflation raises for civil servants. The other one was bailouts. How do you see it in terms of his ideological stance versus a modern economy?
Look, in respect of the first issue, above inflation increases. Now it's a very difficult issue. In the era when I was finance minister, there were systems that made sense. We had something called a mandating committee that was chaired by the Minister for Public Service and Administration. About 4 ministers made input into it, and no agreement could be struck with the public service unions without a sign-off by the mandating committee. After 2009, when Jacob Zuma became president, those kinds of structures fell away. So it wasn't the Minister of Finance, he wasn't at the Public Sector Bargaining Council. That was led by Public Service and Administration without any feedback, and I think that led to a problem. And the difficulty with wage negotiations like that is, if you agree on an increase once, the following year uses that as a baseline. Let's assume that it's a 10% increase. Then the following year you start at 110%. And that's why you see the ratcheting up of the public sector wage bill as rapidly as the structures that were carefully crafted in the early period of our democracy were actually torn apart. That's one side. The other question, what was the other question you raised?
With regards to how does he marry a modern economy with his ideology?
Look, I think that the main task at hand is to deliver democracy.
Right.
That's the main task at hand. And if you think that he was so ideologically bound, then you also have to take account of his stellar performance as Commissioner for SARS. Because that collected taxes fairly, and availed it to the state. I don't actually see a contradiction.
Right. Khaya Sithole, I was reading an article that you wrote before the elections in MoneyWeb, where you quoted from Britain's more flamboyant politicians, Enoch Powell, saying that all political lives, unless they are cut off in midstream at a happy juncture, end in failure, because that is the nature of politics and of human affairs. How close, or does this ring true when we look at Pravin Gordhan's legacy?
Good evening to the viewers and good evening to my fellow panelists. I think the great tragedy of Pravin Gordhan's legacy is that in public discourse, recency and currency tends to take a much stronger role than, history and anecdote, which simply means that people are going to essentially focus much more on what happened in recent years rather than in yesteryear. And unfortunately, in recent years, he did indeed inherit what I refer to as an albatross in 2018, and that was the Department of Public Enterprises. And I think the history of what that department was all about is an important one, is that this was not was formulated out of the state saying that, look, this is the list of 10 or 15 strategies.
Khaya, I think we're having a bit of an issue with Kaya's line. We'll try to redial him in a short while. But let's get some comments from our digital audience. Kustas, let's start with you. Your views on Pravin Gordhan's legacy.
So it meant that there wasn't a linearity in relation to how they were being run. There was no linearity in how they were being governed. So anyone who would have inherited that portfolio would have struggled. What also made it problematic is that at the point in time when it did decided to take on the responsibility of running these enterprises, that was essentially when the sum of the problems at each respective entity had escalated. Eskom was completely falling apart. Transnet had significant problems. SAA essentially had gone into business rescue a few months beforehand. So you can imagine that the sum of those problems would have been a challenge for anyone to manage.
Yeah.
The sum of those problems would have been a challenge for anyone with even the best support to manage. And I think obviously also his political a position and how he viewed how some of these issues must be dealt with, in some instances did not help. And we've seen instances where perhaps he could have been a bit more agile in dealing with some of the critical issues, but I think he tended to retreat to what he knew best, and it wasn't always the way to manage such a complex intersectional portfolio of really quite completely incompatible entities.
Right. Khaya, the magic of, or the problems of technology, but I think we picked up on your point. I'm going to just stand by and try to clear up your line a bit. Kustas, let's hear from you.
Yes, good evening, Blaine, and good evening to the fellow panelists there. Blaine, it's fascinating what I've been listening to this week. The level of lack of honesty sometimes when we speak when a person is dead. I don't know why we cannot actually interrogate that person's life objectively. For some reason, honesty tends to disappear. Now, when you look at Pravin Gordhan, it's important that we acknowledge that he played a very important role in shaping South Africa and many people's lives. And in his first part of as SARS commissioner, he did well. But let's not sort of gloss over the fact that there are many people who lost a lot of jobs in these last 4 years, like Khaya mentioned, 2018 to 2024. And hence, you get the impression that some people are not celebrating, rather, now that he's passed away, you get statements like the EFF did, because a lot of people lost jobs because there were collateral damage of the decisions that he take as a shareholder representative of government. How many people today are sitting without businesses because they decided to appoint the West CEO at Eskom? Between 2023 and 2022, 2021, a lot of South Africans were left without jobs and businesses.
Right.
Because one decision was made to appoint the West guy on the jobs. So there are many people who are crying today. There are many people who are celebrating his lives. That's the nature of the man. You reap what you sow in life.
Mr. Manuel, fair comment in terms of the criticism?
I'd like to hear, apart from the appointment of a CEO at Eskom, what Kustas is actually talking about. Because unemployment and failing businesses are a feature of an economy that is staggering like ours is. And surely the interaction with a state-owned enterprise is only a small part of that.
Let me remind Mr. Manuel that in Limpopo, the judge on Julius Malema's case said to SARS, because remember, at the time, I would like to correct me if I'm wrong, when they chased Julius Malema, Pravin Gordhan was the SARS commissioner. The judge said, why are you using 2 rands to chase 1 rand? That's the only time SARS stopped chasing Julius Malema.
Okay.
Mr. Manuel?
Can we talk about on-point engineering? Can we talk about the theft of virtually the whole public works budget from Limpopo that had the fingerprints of Julius Malema all over it? Are you asking society to okay that kind of behavior? Is that what you're asking, Kostas?
What we're putting forward here is that we have a leader who has created victims in the same manner that they are winners.
Right.
Khaya, so let's tell it as it is.
Khaya, jump in.
Yeah. So I just want to emphasize a couple of points. I think it's important, this idea that we need to be honest in our engagement with how political leaders and political principals engage. And in fact, the article that you referred to was an article that I penned while you were still alive. And then I said, look, we've got a very interesting phenomenon here where Mr. Pravin Gordhan's legacy is essentially a story of 2 eras. I think the era before he got into the public enterprises portfolio, a lot of people do legitimately say that he did the best that he could there. But what is also quite interesting is that if you look, for example, at what the SARS portfolio is all about, the SARS portfolio, the government of the day would give a mandate to the SARS commissioner to say, please create the best institution that you can in order to be able to collect the maximum amount of revenues that you can. So the importance of that distinction is that it isn't an institution where the question of ideological differences or ideological views tend to dominate the conversation. It is a conversation where you ask, what do you think the best structure needs to be, and can put it together. When you then move into a ministry or you move into a political position, it is essentially the definition of trade-offs. And when we talk about the trade-offs, I am of the opinion that whilst Mr. Pravin Gordhan did take on the responsibility of running the public enterprises portfolio, anyone appointed by the ANC to run that portfolio at that point in time would have had the same problem. The sum of the problems is that you had a political party that presided over the gradual decline of the state-owned enterprises over many, many years. And by the time somebody wakes up in 2018 and say, actually, we've got a crisis and we want someone else to manage it, you could literally tell the story of how all of those entities had firstly ended up in the public enterprises portfolio. Again, it was the political trade-offs and the political contestation within the ANC that ended up with a company like, Denel being paired together with a company like SAA, being paired together with a company like Transit and Eskom. They were completely incompatible, but it was a political decision that ANC leaders collectively took. So when somebody is being asked to then run this entity, if I had been asked to give them advice on day one, I would have said, well, tell them the first thing that you must do is actually just disband the portfolio so that each of these entities can go back to where there's policy alignment so you can be able to figure out what you need to do. Right. So you ended up with a portfolio where people were saying, well, it may be a public enterprise's responsibility, but actually all the rules of engagement and all the policy prescription belong somewhere else. So you created these multiple layers of accountability, and I do not know anyone could have done a job of actually running the enterprise over the past 6 years. And I think on the question of his own individual personality, again, a lot of people that have worked with him during the time, I think in particular we speak to the unions that were engaged in the SAA conversations, they have very strong opinions about how he did not yield at instances where everybody says, look, we have a crisis and perhaps the way in which you as the minister are addressing it is not getting us very far. So I do think he has to be validly criticized on that. But the idea that we are only, painting a good picture now, I don't think it's accurate. We've been very clear. We've been engaging. We've been interrogating what he did when you're still alive. And I don't think that the Department of Public Enterprises portfolio was essentially his magnum opus. It was not his greatest years yet, but he did do a lot of work in actually getting the country to get some of the institutions to work better.
It was a big ship to turn around. And I wonder, in terms of the political clout that he had towards the latter part, what sort of impact did that have in his ability to turn around public enterprises in the various SOEs? We need to take a quick break. We'll be back with more. Stay with us. Welcome back. You're watching It's Topical, our question of the week, and we're asking you, what stood out for you in terms of the life and times of Pravin Gordhan? Was a former minister, former SARS commissioner, a lot of roles, consequential roles. Weigh in at SABC News_TV. Now, on a regular word on the street feature, we took to various streets of Johannesburg, seeking diverse insights and perspectives on the passing of Pravin Gordhan. And this is what people had to say. Take a look.
Pravin Gordhan has a good legacy in South Africa, in South African politics. He's been a part of a few cabinets in ministry positions, such as the SARS and my Minister of Finance and so forth. There will be obviously some tainting of his legacy through corruption allegations and so forth, but I think he's been a great servant to the South African people and to the South African government.
Well, he has a undoubtedly rich legacy. He's probably going to be most remembered for the role that he played in exposing state capture, in using his special phrase, connect the dots, and in helping others find courage to expose a lot of wrongdoing and a lot of corruption and hopefully put South Africa back on track to where we should be going.
As a young person in politics, I feel like he left a bad reputation because he collapsed majority of the state-owned enterprises, and collapsing the state-owned enterprises, it meant that there were limited budgets for those enterprises, which led to retrenchments of workers, and it also was a big factor that contributed to the youth unemployment rate.
That's a great leader, first of all. We love what he did for South Africa as a whole, because he fought in apartheid and he managed to join the struggle with black people as much as he was of another race.
During his tenure, he has failed to stabilize ESCOM, which led to power outages and also corruption and mismanagement of the entity.
Well, I think the first thing is when he became in charge of state-owned entities, they were in a very difficult situation. And also he came into looking after those at very difficult times economically. So almost no matter what one does in those situations, you're not going to please all the people. Some people will be very unhappy with what you do. Some people will be happy.
I appreciate your thoughts on this matter. Mr. Manuel, how did we get to a point where it's either or with regards to his legacy? I mean, we heard glowing tributes from the Amit Kathrada Foundation event where you spoke as well. Then we hear statements like from the EFF when they say, we will not shed a tear for the likes of Pravin Gordhan, nor will we celebrate the false legacies created by his apologists. How did we get to this point?
Well, I think that we've lost, as South Africans, some of us have lost our humanity. We no longer have respect for anything or anybody. And I called out that EFF statement because I think it is atrocious. It's more atrocious coming from a body that has not been transparent about its sources of revenue. It's gone against SARS primarily because of its connection to tobacco smugglers, and Pravin stood in the way of that kind of malfeasance in society. And hence the call that Pravin is corrupt, the call that Pravin is arrogant. I mean, it's an irony because if you look at the behavior of the leadership of the EFF, then you'll understand exactly how much of a problem it is.
Khaya Sithole, the perception of arrogance, where does it stem from in terms of your assessment? Could it be his interactions towards the latter part again in these portfolio committees where he strongly pushed back against things that he didn't find was in line with his thinking? What's your thoughts?
Look, I think there were definitely instances where people felt that the information exchange that would have enabled greater scrutiny of a very complicated portfolio were not being enabled by either his conduct or the department's view on particular issues. And obviously, for a lot of people, the Takatso deal probably looms large as the one great problem where people felt that, look, as South African citizens, it is difficult for South African citizens to hear that a state entity has been sold for 51 rand. If you're having that conversation with Mr. Trevor, Manuel, and myself, you get a very different answer because we can then take you through the whole process of how deals are structured. But it was the responsibility of the minister and the ministry to ensure that that conversation did not become an echo chamber between people like ourselves. And I think in that instance, it created significant anxieties where people simply felt that he was essentially behaving like a law unto himself. It also didn't help that even those portfolio committees, which were obviously supposed to hold him accountable, they also seemed to form the view that they were not getting as much or clarity out of that particular deal as they needed to do. And that obviously then simply means that not only do you have citizens confused about what's going on, you also have their elected representatives saying that actually we also cannot explain what's going on in this instance. So I think a lot of people will probably always remember that as probably the one instance where his conduct in relation to the sensitivity of the issues and the delicate nature of what needed to be communicated was not as good as it needed to be. And obviously for a lot of people, it's simply a matter of, well, if you don't think we're good enough to know about how these things are, then it simply means that you are just too arrogant to treat us in the manner that you needed to be treated. And I think that is something that he would acknowledge probably could have been managed better if he were still alive. It was something that he must acknowledge, that he would acknowledge that actually was creating great disconnect, not only between him and the public, but also, as we later learned, between him and his then Director General, who then took the view that actually the minister had been less than candid in engaging with the public in relation to that particular deal. I think also one other instance that I could cite is obviously just how lethargic a decision-making process in relation to the appointment of key personnel at critical state enterprises would have been. And I think, Mr. Manuel, I emphasized an important point earlier on that Mr. Pravin Gordhan was never the CEO of any entity. However, he was the one that had the capacity to then say to an ESCOM board, sorry, the memorandum says you should have sent me 3 names, you've only sent me 1, so therefore start again. And the question would have been surely in their continuous engagements with him and you know, the minister and the board, they could have said, okay, actually, in the process, please make sure that you honor the memorandum, give me 3 names so that we should be in a position to actually fast track the process rather than it being essentially left in limbo, which for a lot of people, particularly where we were in relation to load shedding, did feel like it was an abrogation of responsibility.
Let's go to our digital audience. And Paul, what stands out for you in terms of the life and times of Pravin Gordhan? What did you make of his brand of politics?
There's actually quite a lot. I think something that former minister asked is, why are people so crass about this approach or about everything that happened? And I think a very important element to it is there's a difference between a politician and a bureaucrat. The late minister started as an activist, went on to be a bureaucrat, did a lot of work with SARS, which was very positive. We got to see the automation and technological integration. We got to see the capacity building and training within SARS. We got to see a lot of improved services as a whole. And then once he made his move to politician, the audience also changed. So the people you interact with, the people you're at service to also receive your roles differently. Therefore, when it came to his later years, unfortunately, people are normally remembered based on what is in people's recent memories versus what is in the earlier memories. So when it came to the state-owned enterprises, the collapses of, Transnet, Eskom, SAA, for example, and the immediate impacts that a lot of people felt, people have more contention towards that because these are actions and these are consequences that they felt directly, or these are actions that had some sort of direct linkage with their personal lives, as opposed to with SARS, which was something that was not necessarily a political designation. So the response from people becomes different. However, it is very important to note that with as much bad that happened, there was also quite a lot of good. And I do think it is very important when people pause for us to highlight both their contributions and the destructions on the one end, because the contributions make life simpler for everybody, and it is important to advance the work that they did. And then on the bad side, it is also important to highlight that so that we can not only acknowledge some of the destructions people caused, but also find ways to avoid those going in future, right? So he was a rounded character, so to speak. Politically, he will always be remembered for his work with the NIC and his fight against apartheid, which is something that's commendable. And fortunately, with his lost portfolios, that is something that's also going to always be attached to his name and legacy. So we'll have to take the good with the bad whenever we're discussing him and his legacy.
Mr. Manuel, I wonder, pull back the curtain for us towards the recent past. Did he feel that he needed, Pravin Gordhan, that is, needed to explain more his decision-making, his approach to matters? Do you think he felt that he was misunderstood largely?
Yes, that was clearly there. The point about this is that from 2009, there was a great deal of instability in government appointments. Pravin was appointed Minister of Finance in 2009. He served a term. There was probably a very solid basis for him to continue. He was moved to COGTA to look after provincial and local government. You have to start building relations anew and so on. And then after the complete fiasco of the president firing Nhlanhla Nene, then bringing in Des van Rooyen, he approached Pravin again in 15?
Yes.
Late 2015, to take the responsibility again. Now, in that entire period, I mean, that was the period after 2000. In fact, my own sense of it is that Jacob Zuma's first term was marked by less aggressive state capture. He used that period to lay the basis. And when he returned after 2014, they went hammer and tongs. And that was the period when, if you look at the boards of the state-owned enterprises, these things were being changed like socks. It was unbelievably problematic. And in the context, so much destruction took place. When Pravin is brought back by President Ramaphosa later, I'm saying it's a very difficult era. Now, I think Khaya makes some very important points about the Takatso transaction. I don't quite understand why it was held like that. Sometimes for a whole host of commercial reasons. You can't go to Parliament and announce things. But there needed to be perhaps a way that was more inclusive. That sought to include especially the portfolio committee members from all parties into an agreement so that they marched along, because nobody owns these enterprises. They're public enterprises, and Parliament has a very important oversight responsibility in relation to them.
I wonder to what extent will the SAA matter stick in the minds of many in terms of his legacy. We'll get to that in a short while. Xolani and then Noel, let's take you both.
Greetings, Blaine, and the nation at large. I'd first like to offer my condolences to the family and friends of Minister and SARS Commissioner, Mr. Gordhan. His work for the South African nation will not be forgotten. So I respected mostly Pravin Gordhan for his respected and open stance, against corruption when he was part of the cabinet. And this brought him into a lot of conflict with some of the factions within the ANC, especially during the Zuma area. So essentially, as a minister during history of the state-owned enterprises, he implemented a lot of anti-corruption measures, that I feel are still being used today to clean up these state-owned enterprises, especially following the years of state capture and COVID-19, which crippled massively, the state-owned enterprises and their capabilities. So essentially, for the context of the GNU, I think that, these are the kinds of principles that would have made one suitable for cabinet and government position.
Okay.
As he evidently prioritized the national interest over partisan politics.
All right,
so the
let's
question I
park it
wanted
there.
to ask,
Just in the need for time. Noel, let me hear from you.
Good evening to everyone and to the viewers at home. I think as we remember the life of Pravin Gordhan, it's clear that he was a man deeply committed to the principles of non-racialism, justice, and public service. His political journey began in the 1970s and as a student leader, and he soon became a key figure in reviving in the Natal Indian Congress, a crucial move in the fight against apartheid. Now, Gordhan was also instrumental in the creation of the United Democratic Front, which united communities, labor, and faith-based organizations against the oppressive regime. And I think in post-apartheid South Africa, his contributions extended into governance, where he played a pivotal role in the Convention for a Democratic South Africa, helping guide the nation toward democracy. Later, as the head of SARS, he turned it into a model institution, even during his tenure as finance minister. He remained steadfast in his fight against corruption and state capture, a battle that defined his later years. And I think his legacy is a reminder of the need for unity, justice, and integrity in leadership, principles which he stood by till the end. His lifelong dedication to the public sector and his unwavering fight for ethical governance.
All right, unfortunately, we'll have to leave it there. I've just got 2 minutes to wrap the conversation, so I need to get some final thoughts. I'm not sure if Khaya is still with us, but Mr. Manuel, just hearing the views of people, and the trend, I guess, continues where his legacy is debated. How do you think people will remember him? What lessons can we learn from your perspective?
Thank you very much, Blaine. I said earlier that Pravin's own view of life was he would have wanted to be remembered as an activist, through different journeys with different responsibilities, but an activist nonetheless. And that's important. That there is no unanimity, I think, is clear from the way in which the panel has raised issues. There's only one issue I want to raise, and that is that we never lose respect for each other. It's a point you made earlier. As South Africans, we must learn to discuss with each other, to disagree with each other, but never to lose respect for and to focus on the issues, because parts of what we'd seen in this past few days are ad hominem attacks. You can never resolve the lessons of history in that way. We need to be clearer, and I think always more respectful of the views of others.
Thank you, everybody, for your time. I don't see Khaya here, but I want to thank him as well for the perspective of the moment, value added, no doubt. Mr. Manuel, appreciate your time as always. I guess our strength is a function of our respect for one another. I think that's important. All right, before we go, here's my take. And whether you liked Pravin Gordhan or not, whether you agreed with his brand of politics or not, his passing gives us an opportunity to think about what kind of leaders we want for this country, who symbolizes what the best South Africa can be. And once again, it's an opportunity to ask ourselves these hard questions. Do you expect your public representative to be a model of rectitude, embodying morally correct behavior or thinking all the time? Perhaps that is the ideal, but how close can we get to that? For me, leadership is, among other things, about consistency and accountability. The flagrant abuse of fact and circumstance is something we can do without. The problems we face as a nation are real. But are our leaders really aware of this? It is in the answering of these questions that allows us to reach that ethical excellence that we all strive for. And that's my take. If you miss anything on this program, then be sure to watch this episode of It's Topical on YouTube. Democracy 30 up next with Oliver Dixon. If you're watching a repeat of this program, then as always, the news continues. Until next week, my brothers and sisters, take care. Bye-bye.